Hey there everyone. So today I wanted to do a little bit of a different video than the kind I normally do, and I want to basically give a survey of a couple different postmodern slash postcolonial thinkers with regard to the question of the subaltern. Now, the subaltern has spawned as a term into a whole field of study, basically, which is subaltern studies. And the subaltern is basically a term for that which doesn't really have the power to adequately represent itself. It's basically the minority in the most general sense of the word. And the subaltern is, of course, a figure that plays in all sorts of historical questions, philosophical questions, and in the modern, and particularly in the postmodern period, it became a lot more pressing of a question of how is knowledge produced? And there was a notion that some may say was fairly naively swallowed, which was the notion of the thing in itself. That there is a way in which one can grasp the world in the true objective sense. And Kant, for example, problematized the thing in itself by saying that indeed there is a world of things in themselves which exist outside of our perception or knowledge of them. Of course, this is just the very possibility of a real world. But Kant, of course, problematized our ability to actually perceive such a world in itself because, of course, we have to make that world into a world for ourselves insofar as we perceive it, and in perceiving it, it must be translated by the senses, and in so doing, there becomes a sort of split of, well, we can't really get to the world outside of perception, so to speak. Now, as philosophy was developing and changing, this was pushed back against a little bit to say that, in fact, sometimes we can experience the world in a way that doesn't reduce to perception. We are met by affects, for example, which don't merely present themselves as mental representations. They're something we don't actually fully cognize and fully conceptualize as a logically pure concept per se. And all of this is playing into the way we talk about the knowledge of the world. And a particularly important subject of knowledge, of course, is other people. And in post-colonial studies, the question was brought up, well, in the situation of colonialism, you have people being forcibly dominated by colonialist powers. Maybe this is starting with like the Dutch East India Company or the British East India Company, who are starting with a sort of soft colonialism of governance and using various native peoples and taking advantage of their situation to basically make themselves act as workers on behalf of the Dutch East India Company to survey and oversee British rule in India, for example. And when this occurred, the question became, what does it mean to know other people as an object of knowledge? And this led to a number of concerning situations in which we had concepts in Europe that were developing, like race, for example, or the notion of civility or rationality. And what these concepts did is presented themselves as very objective notions of talking about the value or metaphysical slash ontological status of persons. And this has been used from time immemorial. We have people like Aristotle, for example, saying that men have rationality, but women do not. And thus they are of a different status when it comes to talking about our political systems and how best to build the just society. And this, of course, is leading to the entrenchment of patriarchy. Now, these concepts in colonialism served as ways for people propagating colonial rule to give a justification for colonizing certain peoples. They were backward, they were despotic, they were uncivilized. And through concepts like this, we have the apparent need for colonization. And we have, for example, the white man's burden show up. And the white man's burden was basically this notion that Europe was civilized and the Orient, Africa, East Asia, whatever it may be, is uncivilized, and it is the burden of the civilized nations to come in and present their benevolent hand and colonize, and in colonizing, educate and lift up these nations. And it is presented in a way which is both beneficent in some ways, at least insofar as it was a spectacle, it was shown to be beneficent, but it also is patronizing in a sense, because it assumes that one has a duty based on a concept which a lot of postcolonial thinkers have tried to problematize. The notion of civility or rationality, in fact, have a lot of biases behind them, going into what does it mean to be civil. Oftentimes, this came with trying to formalize certain practices, like the caste system in India, for example, and taking this concept and distorting it in a way in which it appeared absolutely necessary to come in and, on behalf of Britain and the civilized nations, come in and subjugate for the purposes of re-educating or civilizing India. And of course, colonialism is taking various forms throughout history, and oftentimes this is violence. Now, sometimes this is not initially a direct violence. For example, en masse, colonial encounters early on in Africa took the form of establishing various portside colonies, as Portugal did, for example, in which they would basically, on kind of the east coast of Africa, they would establish these colonies that would basically rule the sea. And as ships went around Africa and came back around the Horn to get towards India, for example, the Portuguese would be there to levy taxes and whatnot and grant them safe passage. So initially, these colonies were, of course, very small and often had to be established in an intrusive manner and in a destructive manner. But when it came to, for example, establishing the transatlantic slave trade, oftentimes this occurred by the Europeans merely showing up in Africa and establishing a demand for slaves, which would often be met because African peoples wanted some sort of compensation that would be given by Europeans, and they would take the slave trades that already existed in their lands, and they would siphon slaves off to the coasts where they would be sold and rounded up in these ships, and we know the story from here, not that it's not important. So oftentimes there is a sort of trickle-down effect, starting from a not super intrusive colonialism to a more extreme and intrusive colonialism, in which at first there is merely a gradient being established, an economic demand or a cultural difference, which merely by being set up, sets up a whole course of future events which are going to play themselves out. And for example, in Africa, this took the form of, by establishing that demand for slaves by the Europeans, this upset African markets, such that now there was a need to accelerate the rate at which slaves were being captured, which means increased infighting among African groups, which means more likelihood that groups are going to fall and are going to be in a state of poverty in which they will be more likely to become slaves. So merely the sudden increase in demand leads to the destruction of many of these African tribes and African regions that is going to exponentially increase the presence of slaves and the transport of slaves. And this, of course, just by the introduction of these little historical changes, present themselves as a whole wave of movements which establish subalterns. And I use the term in quotes because it can be derogatory if not used in a suitably safe manner per se. Because by subaltern, we don't mean to imply that people are inherently in the subaltern position. In fact, the notion of the subaltern itself was created as a way to analyze how did people get to this position. Because as postmodernism was starting to enter the field, so to speak, these naive notions of civility or rationality or despotism or duty are being challenged, and identities too, and knowledge itself is being challenged and questioned insofar as it is produced in a biased way. And one of the important figures here in establishing the notion of the subaltern is Michel Foucault. And Foucault is a very tenuous figure for some in postcolonial studies because he is seen as himself presenting a naive picture of how power works, that it's too one-sided. But I would like here to go through Foucault, Edward Said, Homi Bhabha, Paul Virilio, Jean Baudrillard, and Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari. We can kind of put them into the same camp here. And this is an interesting set of figures because most of these are not explicitly post-colonial theorists, but they take up a significant portion of academic philosophy in the mid to late 20th century. And they, of course, occupy a very central role still today in critical theory, literary criticism, postmodernism, obviously, because these are the figureheads of this movement. And because these are the people that I feel the most confident in terms of understanding the work, I think it's important to consider some of the implications that their ideas have on talking about the notion of the subaltern, partially in a way to understand not only the condition they're in, but what is the future for subaltern people, which is to say people who are subjugated, people who are ghettoized, people who are disenfranchised. Now, Michel Foucault is a very interesting thinker precisely because he can be seen as both a historian and a philosopher. What he sees himself doing is l'archéologie du savoir, which is to say an archaeology of knowledge. And we can imagine this like indeed some kind of mountain, and it has layers, and we're taking off these layers. We're looking at the patterns, maybe like a natural scientist would, where they're taking all sorts of data from soil samples or whatever, and trying to pick out a history of how was this mountain established. Instead of just assuming that the mountain exists there, instead we take a critical eye to what exists and figure out the history of something in order to deconstruct its notion of being absolute and to figure out the methods which worked in order to create this mountain. And this analogy is pretty fitting for what Foucault is trying to do. Foucault basically presents these historical studies particularly with an eye to French society, although it often goes beyond just French society and works for kind of Western Europe in general, the United States. And he tries to unearth concepts that he sees as having a lot of socio-political significance and of philosophical significance because of that. The first work he does is on madness, where he basically looks at madness and says, okay, how is the notion of the madman established in order to ostracize certain people? And in doing this, he establishes and indeed unearths certain trends within discipline and within state power that aims at certain ideals for what a human should be. So hence, normative judgments are a part of this. What should the ideal citizen be? And Foucault unearths that, in fact, the ideal citizen is someone who should work as an important one that is established. Also, they must uphold certain virtues. Often, these virtues are Christian virtues, or they are framed through a Christian lens of this is why you ought to replicate this sort of ideal. So these, in fact, very biased notions of what is virtuous, or what is the ideal citizen, what makes you worthy of protection under the state, these slip into notions such as madness, such that madmen are put in various institutions, for example, to isolate them, to control them, maybe to educate or reform them, in such a way that they can be integrated into a society which absorbs this bias. And also in Discipline and Punish, he does this same thing with the notion of criminality and discipline to show how, in fact, what it means to be a criminal is tied up in these normative value judgments of, well, what ought an ideal member of society be? And in doing this, of course, coincides with the creation of various apparatuses, often state apparatuses, such as penal institutions, asylums, governing apparatuses, whose job it is to give an objective grounding to these notions by creating a system which finally dices up society and can establish these notions as if they were eternal. And, for example, this takes the place of, in disciplinary societies, of switching the object of punishment from the body to the soul, which is to say from physical punishment to punishment of the will, of the inclinations, of one's thoughts. And it becomes a question of reforming to some sort of ideal position. And what all this is doing in Foucault's work is taking these notions, which are knowledge, which are known, and figuring out the biases that are behind them, the institutions that are behind them that allowed them to come about. And in so doing, he is unearthing, via this archaeology, various discourses. So maybe this is the clinical discourse, or the penal discourse. Maybe this is the scientific discourse. He does that in Le Mot et les Choses, The Order of Things. In these various discourses, there is basically an allocating of power, which is going to establish who's writing the history, so to speak, who is creating and controlling the dissemination of various concepts. And what this does is it greatly problematizes the notion of objective knowledge. Because what Foucault shows is that, in fact, power is not only controlled by knowledge, but Foucault comes up with a new concept, really, which is power knowledge, power-knowledge. That power itself is knowledge, and knowledge itself is a form of power. Insofar as just the idea that we can accept certain concepts as being genuinely objective can in themselves, for example with the notion of civility, lead to colonialism. It can lead to the notions of duty which are based off of a false premise that someone is civilized and someone else is not. Maybe this can take certain religious aspects too. For example, the spread of Catholicism. And this can look at the Middle East and it can say, well, these people have the wrong faith. So we're going to go on this mission and we're going to correct them or kill them. So Foucault's important addition is that knowledge is defined discursively, in a discourse, that it is bound up with certain notions of who has power and who doesn't. And this power does not just exist objectively, but rather comes about through the coalescing of, well, I have more, I don't know, maybe I have more economic capital, for example. Maybe I have more capital than you. And as such, I can take a little difference that is just happenstance and make it a lot bigger of a difference. And in so doing, start to create institutions, states, apparatuses, which work to my advantage. Now, after Foucault, along comes Edward Said in 1978, and he writes this work called Orientalism. And Orientalism basically takes this Foucauldian paradigm that knowledge and power are inextricably linked together, and that knowledge and power are a function of one another, and he expands this to postcolonial studies. He takes a look at the civilizing missions and the colonialist missions of various French and British thinkers and conquerors, and looks at the rhetoric that they are using in their various historical documents, in popular culture, to justify their civilizing mission. And one of the principal terms that keeps cropping up is this notion of the Orient versus the Occident. And the Orient is the East, and the Occident is the West, basically. And these terms, of course, are not innocent. Oftentimes these terms are quite taboo today precisely because they are charged with a lot of negative connotations on the part of the member of the Orient and a lot of positive connotations, perhaps dangerous connotations, on the part of the member of, the Occident is the one that has the positive characteristics. The Orient has the negative characteristics. I don't know if I misspoke there. But laden within these notions, we have, as I mentioned before, the notion of civility. There's basically this notion that keeps getting tossed around in academic discourses of Oriental despotism. And this leads to all sorts of, you've got like phrenologists and race scientists and various academics and Oriental studies programs that are coming about, which are creating this vast quantity of academic knowledge, and that's really important, that academia is not just necessarily objective, creating this academic knowledge in this build-up, this bibliography of what is the Orient. And in so doing this, what happens is these biases crop up that, people in the Middle East don't know how to govern themselves. They are inherently unable to create a stable form of government because of some sort of biological thing, maybe it's some sort of religious reason, all sorts of reasons we could imagine for why someone would think this. And in fact, sometimes this is grounded in their very language, where you have linguists who are basically trying to establish, for example, the link between violence and the language of Arabic itself. Very interesting, but very dangerous idea, because what it tries to do is it uses the objectivity of academic study to, in fact, build up a corpus of knowledge which is biased against an entire group. And Said mentions throughout the book that there are a number of contradictions that exist in the very notion of the Orient. There are double binds that these Orientals are in in which they are both cunning and despotic, but also stupid and ignorant, which is weird. They're existing on both of these registers at once. When you travel there, you should, they're going to be stupid, but also they're going to be so cunning and be able to steal from you and take advantage of you. And these various contradictions are building up such that, in fact, the very existence of the Orient is defined by the Occident. So Said is trying to problematize the notion of the Orient as such, that the Orient can exist as some naive, objective knowledge claim. And what he's showing is, in fact, the power disparities that play out in the construction of the Orient-Occident split is going to lead to a disparity in those two positions, in which the Orient is naturally going to be in a place where they need to be subjugated, they need to be civilized, they need to be given government, whatever it may be. And even the very notion of the Orient, of where that is entirely ambiguous. It's kind of like sometimes the Orient is just like Jerusalem and the Levant. Sometimes it's the Middle East and even Maghreb. Sometimes it's getting into Central Asia as well. It goes all the way to China and various East Asian countries. So the Orient is basically this weasel word that Said sees as basically being the punchline for any European discourse that wants to set up the existence of something in an academic setting such that it's only natural that it be colonized or whatever it may be. And he looks at the Balfour Declaration and talks around the end of World War II with regards to the Ottoman Empire. And Said's whole point is that when we look at the Orientalist discourse, this academic study that consists of the amassing of knowledge, we have a greatly problematic notion of, it seems like we aren't actually hearing the Orient's voice, which is to say the voice of the subaltern, but we are hearing the voice which is given or imparted upon them by a Western perspective. And, now Orient and Occident has just been replaced with East and West. And now it's even changed into global North and global South. So we basically just recycle these terms as if there was some binary way to set up power that is going to define all of our knowledge. And of course, Said isn't saying that all knowledge is reducible to some binary of Orient versus Occident, East versus West. But what he's showing is that with the advent of power and the buildup of institutions, it will tend to those binaries because, well, it's easy to point the finger and say, this is the bad guy, or this is the backward person who is threatening me, for example, just by existing. And Said's key point here is that the existence of the Orient does not exist in the literary sense except as an object of knowledge for the Occident. That the Orient is given a voice, and Said, at various times in the book, mentions how this really problematizes how would the Orient actually be able to speak for itself. Because Said mentions that, for example, even when we start allowing people to speak from these disenfranchised subaltern areas, we have the problem of our biases are going to decide who can we let into the discourse who's not going to upset things too much, who might be able to make little changes, but grounded in this false start of the difference between the Orient and the Occident is going to gradually build up and merely change the position of a mass whose center has already been defined from the beginning. And we basically have a solar system that we can't get out of. So Said, in writing various other works as well on Palestine and on imperialism, more specifically in terms of like culture and stuff like this, is problematizing the notion of the subaltern having their own voice. As Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak says, can the subaltern speak? There's a famous essay that she wrote regarding this question, which is largely in a Foucauldian paradigm, just like Said, where she basically says, no, the subaltern cannot speak because their very existence as subaltern is grounded on these false assumptions which basically temper their ability to upset the system. Now, Said has been crucial in the field of postcolonial studies, but there are a number of criticisms that are brought up against him, and I think one of the thinkers that is really able to get out of this strictly Foucauldian discursive, absolute, here's the subaltern, here's the non-subaltern, the subaltern is screwed. The person who is really able to get out of this for me when it comes to postcolonial studies is Homi Bhabha. Now, Homi Bhabha's work is very complex. His language is very advanced. He's a very lovely thinker for me, and I really love the way he brings in actual experiences of people experiencing colonial rule and talking about, for example, in his seminal work, The Location of Culture, we basically have a lot said right there in the title. He's trying to figure out how culture is defined, which is going to have a pseudo-Foucauldian kind of, culture is a discursive question of who has power, who is getting to write the histories and whatnot. But also, the notion of location is important, because we have not only the notion of space being biased by the notion of culture, but time, temporality, location within time is a question of power too. And Homi Bhabha is basically trying to find a way to look at culture in a way that isn't so binaristic, like Said's work tends to take us towards. So in Said's work, obviously, power dynamics are going to tend to disparate binaries, to dichotomies, because that's the easiest way to point the finger. I mean, that makes sense. Jean Baudrillard in Symbolic Exchange and Death basically says that every good simulacrum knows how to make itself into a binary, knows how to make itself into two sides that can fight against each other, but really ultimately they're on the same trajectory, much like the political parties here in the US. And in Homi Bhabha's work, he looks at these various colonial encounters, and he looks at the work of Frantz Fanon, for example. And in these, the notion of some original cultural identity is something that he's trying to get away from. The notion that innocent identity exists, like all these other postmodern thinkers, of which I think Homi Bhabha and Edward Said would definitely be, the notion of innocent identity is being thrown out. And Said, on his part, is very keen to see how the subaltern is created from above, how their identity is imparted upon them. But Homi Bhabha tries to look at culture and see how can the subaltern push up? How can they impart upon themselves their own identity? Now, Bhabha uses the notion of cultural hybridity to establish this notion. And I mean, the name is basically on the tin. Cultural is a hybrid question. It is imposed from the top down, and it is also built up from the bottom up. Now, you might be thinking, if you're like a Foucauldian in the kind of Edward Said sense, that, well, once this power disparity has been set up, and you have, for example, someone living in the Orient who is oppressed by colonial rule, how are they going to be able to get up out of their position without having the colonial power already have subjugated them in ways which they only have very limited paths available to them? And Homi Bhabha, in his work, looks at various colonial encounters. And for example, he mentions a case in India, and there are these tribes in India who exchange these wafer cracker kind of things between the different tribes. They have a special person who goes out and sends these to various other tribes. And the colonial powers don't know what to make of these wafers. They're called chapatis. And I guess chapatis with the proper T sound. The European powers, particularly the British, who are ruling over India at this time, are looking at the chapatis, and they don't know, is this being used as a way to communicate a warning signal to other tribes? Is this reaching out a hand of friendship to establish a coalition to revolt against the colonial powers? Is it something else that, because of one's cultural biases, they can't even think of what it could be? And Homi Bhabha, for example, mentions a primary source in which one of the British soldiers speaks of this sending an electric thrill through the British soldiers of they're not sure how they should respond to this very benign practice. And in showing practices in situations like these, Homi Bhabha is showing that a discourse is built to accept certain objects of knowledge. You have certain things which make sense in a paradigm. Paradigm and discourse are very similar to one another. But there are certain notions which can't be accounted for without leaving some sort of electric effect in their wake, in a way which testifies to subaltern agency, which cannot be co-opted by the colonial power without some sort of pushback. And in doing this, Homi Bhabha basically looks at dialectics in a Hegelian way of you have a master and a slave. This is like the colonial and the subaltern characters. And in this dialectic, you have something with an identity, such as the European, and then you have an other which appears. And both of these threaten each other's identity precisely because they show the impotence of each other's identity. But these require each other in order to make sense because they're opposites. And the opposition in the dialectic needs to be sublated into some sort of higher truth which takes account of both of these dialectical moments, to use Hegel's framework, and in so doing establishes a truth that can reconcile them together. And oftentimes, this is going to disparage, in the case of the colonial situation, it's going to disparage the lower term in this dialectic. So what's being set up here is, much like in the case of Said's work, a question of two sides of the coin in which one side of the coin is significantly more disparaged and put on a false start, such that their agency is called into question. But in this uneven dialectic, there is still the possibility, and indeed must always be a possibility, for the subaltern to communicate, to signify in some way which cannot be accounted for. As Homi Bhabha says, adding to, but not adding up. And this introduces what Bhabha calls a third space of this cultural hybridity, where culture is contested, and where the subaltern has the possibility to unearth themselves and basically do their own archaeology of looking at this discursive field that is establishing the ways in which they are subjugated, and strategically finding ways to express their identity in ways which cannot be fully understood or subsumed by the power who has power. Now, looking at the work of Jean Baudrillard, Baudrillard likes to flirt with some very disruptive themes, like violence, irony, reversal, sort of transgressive acts which are able to work in this play of images, which is the simulacrum, and is able to create a sort of reversal or express some sense of agency from a position by embracing fatal strategies or ironic strategies. And this notion of the play of images that is the simulacrum might sound very strange, but this is really another way of talking about a discourse, where we have, because the true objective Orient or Occident doesn't exist in a sense, precisely because our very knowledge of something requires carrying with it certain biases. Even our very perception itself is biased. This is an important point of phenomenology. So with these biases, we essentially get to a point where knowledge, especially in these complicated modern systems of academic knowledge, we have a play of images, of biased, one-sided dialectics which are proliferating. And Baudrillard thinks that one of the important strategies that shouldn't be outstripped is the possibility to give a fatal response which cannot be countered. And he's taking this partly from the work of Marcel Mauss, who is giving this theory of the gift of these societies that focus on gift giving, and it's sort of this upping the ante constantly of giving gifts back and forth, but sometimes a gift is given of which a gift cannot be given back because it's so transgressive, it's so upsetting, or something like this. And Baudrillard takes this to some interesting places, and Baudrillard hardly ever talks about colonialism, and I think this is part of the downside of his philosophy in general, is that it is generally, because Baudrillard, if you've read any of his work, is fighting against the notion of the real, strictly speaking, in kind of a sort of naive objective sense, like we've been talking about. He's much more willing to talk about pataphysics, which is to say the science, not of reality like metaphysics, but the science of imaginary solutions, or the study of imaginary solutions. And Baudrillard's point is that one of the key possibilities being stripped away from all people in the modern age is the uncertainty of life, particularly when it comes to the uncertainty of death. And death is something which plays a central part in a lot of earlier societies that haven't built these complex infrastructures to fight against death necessarily. War is very prevalent, but through the Enlightenment, we had these notions arise, and of course not explicitly with the Enlightenment, of course, but these ideas become a lot more popular in Europe of the definition of the human. And of course, initially, if you look at the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, or the Constitution of the United States, or the Declaration of Independence, or, all these different documents, if you look at them, of course, the citizen of the state is often defined as a land-owning white man. And as these societies are being created, we have death basically being forestalled. We have apparatuses which are aimed at staving off death to try to find some triumph over death. And Baudrillard sees this as a sort of Nietzsche's last man moment, in which we think we've triumphed over death precisely because death is precisely what holds us in our place and keeps us from operating in a way that's more unpredictable, more exciting, more life-affirming. So for Baudrillard, an important strategy, and he calls them fatal strategies, but I think when we take this to the idea of postcolonial studies, we can really think of these as subaltern strategies, is the notion of violence. And this will, of course, play out in the work of Frantz Fanon, for example, who's going to focus on anti-colonial violence. And an important element of violence for Baudrillard is that this is seen in modern society as a line that cannot be crossed. But in fact, this moment in which we reach this axiomatic of pacifism is actually a moment in which we allow ourselves to be ruled by these static models of the ideal human, of various questions of you must have an identity, you must be accountable, you must be reducible to a statistic, all these different things acting on the modern person, which is going to interfere with the notion of agency. Now, Paul Virilio's work is hardly ever mentioned in postcolonial studies, and probably rightly so. Surprisingly, he talks about colonialism more in his work than Baudrillard does. But for Virilio, he's concerned particularly about the construction of spaces and the relationship of that space to time, the passage of time, and the development of weapons. He's particularly looking at the way in which speed of development, speed of proliferation of societies, of ideas, plays into the development of societies in ways which is often going to reduce to some problematic ideas, such as civility, and thus the need to conquer. And for Virilio, he looks at the way in which various societal attitudes have developed alongside military technology to point out that the notion of space itself, of territory itself, becomes a moving agent, which he calls a vehicle, which is basically now set on a constant collision course to encounter something new, to expand into something new. And this, of course, we see this in capitalism today, with the insistence on increasing profit, developing and infiltrating into burgeoning markets, increasing the amount of capital that one owns. And in doing this, there is an axiomatic of proliferation, of expansion, of acceleration, which takes hold of society as a whole, and coincides with the increased effectiveness of weapons technology to the point of nuclear technology, which operates strictly on deterrence, on putting people into a vehicle which is controlled by factors they don't really control. Things like markets, for example. The world is beholden to markets today, but no single person can really say that they have control of the world market because it's a world market. And it is controlled by axiomatics like capital, which are going to constantly be trying to increase the rate of trade, increase profit. And when this plays into society, we have the constant increase of likelihood for Virilio of an accident, of the fatal accident. And the accident is the result, of course, of this buildup of weapons technology, of increased proliferation, of acceleration, in which as we are approaching and going beyond certain limits, say this is the limits of a state's territory as it is expanding, particularly its influence through intelligence technology in like the US, for example, what we have is a situation in which all are on a collision course for a common goal, which is going to be triumphed by the accident. So for Virilio, his thought is much more nihilistic and for him, the subaltern's position is really only savable by going faster than the other positions, by being more radical, for me, I think this takes on some very problematic notions of becoming more capitalistic, making more profit, exploiting other people more. But one of the possibly equalizing factors in Virilio's philosophy is the notion of the accident, because it applies to the whole world. And for example, in the modern day and age, this is obviously an ecological accident, is probably what this accident would be. So for Virilio, there is a possible saving grace, albeit a very fatal saving grace. Finally, we have Deleuze and Guattari. And these two thinkers are some of my favorites, and I think their contributions are much in line with Homi Bhabha, insofar as Homi Bhabha is fighting against this reductive notion of the dialectic that reduces itself to the oppressor and the oppressed, which obviously is an undeniable reality of there are people who are oppressed. But in terms of thinking about subaltern agency, a problematic of Said's philosophy is that oftentimes the way knowledge presents itself and the way it is structured, obviously, makes it very difficult to imagine much substantive change happening inside of a system that is working against minorities, subaltern voices, whatever you want to call it. But Deleuze and Guattari make a very substantive point to reverse a common assumption, which is that form, stasis, established ideas are primary, and that variation or chaos or change is secondary. In the context of, for example, the city, the traditional notion is that the more you get into the center of a city, the closer you get to that point of centralization, the closer you get to the stability of the system. And then as you go out, you have poorer and poorer areas, less and less densely populated areas, and as such areas which are more likely to change, more likely to experience housing crises and things like this. And this is very true. This is the existence of ghettos today. And this plays into the notion of urban sprawl, where you have an urban center which is able to proliferate like a cancer by basically using these ghettos as a protective shield, which can absorb any sort of problematic, there's a crisis and people need to expand from the city center into these ghettos, or, there's an increased need for jobs, so the people from these ghettos funnel into the city. They basically act as an in-between space to act as a shield, a sort of intermediary between the true territory and the outside. So the ghetto appears as a sort of second space, and really, in Homi Bhabha's terms, really a third space, because the ghetto is, of course, one of these binaries which Baudrillard is talking about every good system knows how to make. It knows how to make this binary between the center and the exterior, and make the exterior work to expand outwards. And in doing this, it expands the likelihood that housing in these areas will be less valuable, and thus people will become more poor, and thus become more likely to resort to crime, and thus people will start leaving that area who are more wealthy, and thus the property value will decrease, and thus corporations can buy this property, and then they can fix it up. They can use police presence to force those people out of that area. Then they can raise the price and sell it to people who are wealthy, and slowly expand the center of the city. This is ghettoization. But really what is being shown here in ghettoization is that the power of expansion lies not in the center, but at the periphery. That in fact, the motor driving the state is chaos, is the ability to deterritorialize. And in so doing, the periphery, or the subaltern, actually shows itself to have the most subversive potential because it itself is succumbed to the most movement. The center of the city depends upon the exterior, and the flexibility of this exterior, which basically proliferates around the outside of the city and acts as a protective wall, a sort of diffuse, semi-permeable membrane of sorts. Takes on very biological sort of connotations here. But in so doing, Deleuze and Guattari basically are going to set up their own sort of subaltern, non-subaltern binary, which is the majoritarian and the minoritarian. And the minoritarian is in fact the voice or the position which is the driving force of change, which, because it can slip into the interstices, because each member of this community is, for example, much more populous than the majoritarian position, right? The poor are much more populous than the ultra-rich. They, in fact, not only have the, statistical number of actors present, but their position is often very ambiguous, as was the case with the Chapatis in the case of India. And the minoritarian position thus carries the capability to seep into roles that cannot be coded or completely overcoded, just in the case of Homi Bhabha's work, in which the minoritarian position shows itself the most capable of bringing out the very performative notion of the objective place of power as the city center, to bring that into question precisely by showing how it is not the periphery which depends on the center, but the center which depends on the periphery. And this is going to lead Deleuze and Guattari to talk about all these notions of becoming woman, becoming animal, becoming minoritarian, becoming imperceptible. And all of these are aimed at showing that, in fact, the power of difference is the primary force in their metaphysics, which is guiding the production and creation of what is taken to be actually the most strong and the most powerful. And in so doing, they are opting for us to take a similar strategic angle, like Bhabha is asking us to do, and look at our lines of flight, our flows, our faces, as they call it in A Thousand Plateaus. And in so doing this, we see that there are always, as they say, something must always slip from the box. There is always some possibility open which cannot be coded for without having some sort of response which cannot be responded back. So I hope this has been interesting in terms of looking at the notion of the subaltern through these various postmodern and postcolonial thinkers. Check out any of my other content that I've done on postmodernism, postcolonialism, German idealism, gender theory. Leave any constructive or non-constructive criticism in the comments below, and I'll see you in another lecture.